All right. Hello, everyone. This is Brian Trautschold, founder of Ambition, and we are back with the Sales Operator series. And I'm joined today by Lauren Davis. Lauren, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm thrilled to connect with you and speak with you. I've been following you on LinkedIn, and you were recommended to come join us. I know you've been in the RevOps, go-to-market, demand gen, sales space for your career. I'm excited to get to chat.
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Awesome. Awesome. One thing that stood out to me as we were kind of like, I was reviewing some of your background is you have gone from the sales side to the demand side to the now like RevOps side and building RevOps teams. How is that like how have you made that transition like intentionally, or was it just like you're riding the waves and going where the wind takes you?
A little bit of both. So the way I describe it is I really like working with people and I'm hyper competitive. So if you're familiar with like the Clifton Strengths Finders competitions, my number one. And so it was recommended like at an early age. My father was in sales and he was like, you should be in sales. And so I did my first job as basically an SDR, which is a phenomenal first job to have and one of the hardest jobs there is. But what I quickly realized is I also get bored really easily. And I actually believe like some of the best sellers I know, they follow a process, right? And while each deal is different, it is a lot of the same motions. So I moved into demand gen where each campaign is different, each day was different, but I was still having that impact on the organization and I could still directly tie my campaigns to performance. And that was similar right around the time where Marketo was becoming more of a thing, marketing automation was becoming more of a thing. So I kind of gravitated more towards the operations side of things. Like if I could automate it, I can't stand inefficiency. I knew my numbers like the back of my hand. That was the most important thing to me. And so as that became more of a thing, and then as RevOps became more of a thing, and you started seeing more companies centralize RevOps, I think in order to be a really good and effective marketer, you need to have a very good relationship with sales. You need to understand how the leads you're generating are progressing through the funnel, generating pipeline. Are they converting to close one? So it was kind of this natural extension into sales operations. And then as you saw more of this centralization motion over time, intentionally kind of pushed in that direction because my brain has always been numbers driven. I always gravitate towards numbers and automation, less so words and talking. So
How does how do the systems and the number and the resources you have in place turn into like achieving the number, the pipeline generated, the close one deals, whatever? And what's fascinating to me is I think that there's been a parallel between a lot of folks who were, not to like knock these people, but they were like Salesforce admins, and then they were like, sales operations, and now they're like RevOps or like a GTM engineer or whatever. And like you're like an operator who's taken that path and has done the demand gen, has done the selling.
yes, I mean, I think the folks coming up through like a Salesforce admin type role can get there too, but it is, to your point, RevOps encompasses so many things. It is systems and tooling, it is data and reporting, but it is process, it's strategy, it's insights. It's not just like the dashboard, but it's what does that actually mean?
Right.
And as numbers driven as I am, I know that only tells part of the story. And so some of the most valuable, like I always make sure I have a few reps that I go to all the time to talk to. I'm like, tell me what's actually happening, right? I'm only seeing one part of the story. And I think that comes directly from being there before and like understanding how sometimes disconnected leadership or operations can get because they're not in the day to day. Right. And so
Right.
you want to have that balance. So I think that's more around what I pull from it.
Yeah. I'm like really interested in that because I at Ambition, I end up being like a step or two or three removed from the conversation that like a seller is having or that's happening on, the top of the funnel. And I'm the person consuming those reports. And I think it's so valuable to have like what you just described, the rep you call and you're like, what's actually going on? Like what's actually, why are these not converting, or why are we not having, why is our days to close, whatever the thing is like, and I Another thing that I'm fascinated about your background is like selling into the organizations you've worked with, like you serve different clienteles, you serve different types of customers. What has that been like in terms of making the transition not only from a role, but also from like a customer base standpoint? Do you have to like dig in and be like, let me understand what it is to work with folks in the trades versus folks who are, buying insurance or buying like an insurance platform as benefits, like those like really different, totally different end customer.
Yeah. When I was looking for my last job, I was chatting with a mentor of mine, my old SVP of sales, and she asked me, one of the first questions she asked me was, "Who do you want to sell into? What industry do you want to be
Interesting.
in?" And I thought that was so interesting coming from a sales leader. It makes a ton of sense. And my response there is it matters less to me as an operator. What matters more to me is the business model. So, for
Okay.
example, Checker was consumption. So I never used the term ARR there because there was no annual recurring revenue. It was just consumption,
Ooh.
right?
Yep.
And it also had a PLG and a self-serve motion. It had a big channel motion. BuildOps, we are 100% sales led. There's no PLG, there's no free trial. It is annual revenue. We're talking about adding in some other types of pricing components, and it is primarily outbound driven, decent amount of inbound, a little less channel partner, right? So like it's how do we go to market is more interesting from my perspective because it influences more the work that RevOps does in a day to day. However, going back to your point around RevOps helping from a strategic perspective, which is going back to your question around why did I kind of push more that way, is I'm very competitive and we can do initiatives that have a large impact, right? So like one of
Okay.
the initiatives at Checker was we updated our pricing and we had to roll that out to all customers and we generated 10 million of incremental revenue like 1 year, right? That's
Wow.
like I love to be able to point to that, right? And I love to see that impact. In order to do that, you still need to understand your customer. You need to understand who you're selling into. You need to understand where the struggles are. I think but what's been really interesting about switching to selling into the trades is that those buyers operate very differently than historically, even when I've sold into HR marketers, I'd say like those are kind of the main ones I've sold into. They were all horizontal businesses and they're all still in tech type companies. Whereas like
Right.
trades is like a totally different industry. Those people operate very differently in a number of ways. And so taking the time to talk to people, to listen to customer stories. One of the first things I did was attend our customer event and just loved talking to all of the different customers around like, tell me what you care about. What's your day to day look like? Like, why did you even find BuildOps? It helps when we're thinking about our annual plan, really where can we push into things?
I think that's like seems like super refreshing. I mean, I've sold to sales leaders, revenue leaders for now, 12 plus years, and I love them. I love you guys, but like that's like a fascinating, different type of customer. So, like, what do you hear? I mean, I'm genuinely curious. Like, you go to that event, or you're, talking to your sellers today. What is the day to day? Because we're all in front of like computer screens for the most part, and I'm assuming a lot of those people are not. That's just a total off the cuff guess. Like, how is it to get their time, get their attention? Are you having to learn this whole new go to market motion, which is like these people who may be going out to a job site or going out to their customer, and you've got to do a totally different go to market motion? Is that kind of the idea?
So you still have folks that are in the office there, especially it depends on the size of the company, right? But you usually still have folks that are in an office by a computer, answering the phone, on email, etc. Those are oftentimes the people you are selling to, but then they're not necessarily the people using the product once they buy
Yeah.
and get implemented. And so I would say that's like one of the largest ones I hear is because the folks who are doing going on calls and doing the service work, they just want to do their job, right? They don't want to
Right.
worry about putting in a bunch of information when they're on the job, right? So part of our job is to make it as easy as possible. How that translates into the business is it's trickled into, you need to not just think about the champion in the deal and the decision maker in the deal and who we're selling the deal to, we need to think about who do we actually need to implement and win over? How do we win them over? How do we get them in the product using the product? How do we make it as easy as possible for them? And so even at small companies, it becomes super multi-threaded across because it's not just that initial sale, it's also the implementation and adoption portion.
I would imagine that and this isn't that different from like our world, selling into a sales organization, but I'm assuming that like sometimes those people in the office, they may be hearing from you guys, but they're getting a bunch of like they may have resistance from the people who want to go do the job and want to go, resistance to any change. We find that across like, change management is ultimately like a lot of what we're, dealing with across everybody. How as like you in a RevOps and your strategic mindset, are you able to like help your sales team overcome some of that resistance or maybe turn what would be resistance into like, yeah, we want this. This is going to make my life a bunch easier as a technician or whatever.
I think that leans more on the enablement side of the house, the
Yeah.
ICP side of the house, like who are we selling into? Who is there a really strong fit for? What are the customer stories we're telling as part of that? How do we communicate value to customers as they're going through this? The other thing that I think about from a RevOps perspective is what do those handoff points between teams look like internally? How do we communicate what we've learned throughout that? And who is responsible for like what parts? And so what I mean by that is if you go through a long sales cycle so we have a fairly in-depth implementation. It's
Okay.
effectively like implementing an ERP. And so you're reworking. It's not just a tool. You're reworking a lot of your workflows, right? And as you go through the sales process, there's an SE attached to every deal, making sure, okay, how will we actually implement this when the time comes? What ERP are you using? How does this work in your workflows, et cetera? How do we take everything that we learned throughout the sales process and communicate that to implementation so that they're not starting from scratch? They're not starting from zero. And sometimes it's a different person involved in the sales deal versus implementation, right? And
Right.
so you also have to do that on the customer side. And so that's a little bit about how I think about from like a process RevOps perspective of like, how do we make those transitions as smooth as possible? So, and maybe this does come from having been on the like sales and marketing side before. I do find sometimes I might get in trouble for saying this. I was just thinking of an example this morning, but I do feel like sometimes RevOps is like so removed that we're not necessarily thinking about what is the actual customer experience here,
Yeah.
right? So
Right.
we're
Right.
digging into like why leads were routed a certain way. And I was like, okay, but those leads we still need to assign them. Like we need to figure out why they were routed that way, but we need to assign them to the team because imagine if you filled out a pricing request form or a demo request form and then didn't hear back, right? So we do need to think about the customer experience as well. And oftentimes when we're thinking about how do we make it as efficient as possible, it's all for the end goal of customer experience.
Yeah, yeah, the customer I've been talking about this a lot, and I feel like this is changing, and maybe you have thoughts from a RevOps perspective, but I feel like we went through this period where whatever you're selling, whatever your process is, we imposed the discovery process, which was kind of like some methodology, but a lot of like, we just need to fill out these fields in Salesforce. Like we just need like all of this data about who's the decision maker, who has the budget, who's going to implement. Like we kind of turned every single part of the selling motion into like, give me data for the fields, like to fill like the Salesforce fields or CRM fields. And to your point about like the experience, I think a lot of our buyers ultimately felt that experience. Like, God, I don't want to deal with this discovery call. And if you like me enough, I'll get a demo. And then if I have enough power, you'll do another call. Like, what do you think? Like, how do you think that's changing? And have you seen that to your point about like the removing the friction in the customer experience? It kind of sounds like, how have you gone about that? Are those things that you see in your world?
So are you saying that folks don't necessarily want to do all the steps of the calls or they don't want to necessarily go through the hassle of making sure Salesforce is up to date.
I guess what I say is, or my experience has been, and I've been like bristling at this recently, which is if someone cold calls me, I'm like, okay, now I know that we're like, you're asking a question to fill in a field based on my response, or to at least get the data captured from the thing I say. Like maybe your call recording thing is going to update it, but I'm like, the whole conversation is actually just like this weird, like, you know, tennis match of like, you batter a question that's actually going to fill out a field, and I'm like, no one's actually asking like the real questions. Does that make sense?
It makes a ton of sense. And because we were talking about this the other day, it shouldn't be treated as a checklist, which I feel like some reps, when they're going through the process, it's like, okay, here's my checklist. Did I ask these things? Check, check, check.
Yes.
The reason why is because it's like, how do you then utilize that throughout the sales process? Right. And so, for example, if you don't do discovery up front and you have a platform that can do a ton of, like, imagine if you were going to buy Salesforce and they didn't do any discovery up front and then they just started demoing you the platform and you're like, I'm actually like only interested in Marketing Cloud, or I'm only interested in this one aspect. Like, there's so many places to focus. And so you really have to understand like what they care about in order to like tailor the demo. The other thing is, so my partner was running a sales training the other day and I overheard him through the wall, and he was doing a session on situational questions. And he was like, the art is not necessarily the questions, but it's how to get what you want and what you need to know in an organic way where it's not an interrogation. And it's not just, okay, I need to ask these 5 questions. How do I do that? And it was just like, it was awesome to overhear how he was like illustrating. He just started like asking someone like 20 questions and they were like, this doesn't feel great, right? Like, it's how do you make it or an organic conversation just like this, right? Where you get the person talking and it's not just quiet on the phone and someone being like, okay, what's the next thing you need to know about me? And you can just be honest around like, this is what I'm looking for. Okay, well, in order to get you what you're looking for, I need to know these 5 things. Like,
Yeah.
we're working towards the same thing here.
I have like secondhand embarrassment about how we've done it over the past like many years, where I'm just like, and I'm maybe it's more on the enablement side. I know this like ends up touching some of the RevOps side, but like you build these whether it's like aggregating signals or aggregating like, your forecasting quality based on like what people have in the opportunity. And so you come up with this great plan. You're like, man, if we know they have this and they have this desire and they have this initiative and whatever, then you're like, it's going to be super high quality. And it like the tail starts wagging the dog, if that makes sense, where it's like, now you're like, every seller needs to get me this info. And what happens is you've got this, great young salesperson and they're just going through the checklist, like you said, it's like, I don't know how I still haven't figured out how we perfectly do what your partner was describing, which is like, you gotta make it, you gotta hide all that stuff. You're just getting the information in a organic way.
Yeah, when I started, so I was an SDR at a company called EMC. They're now owned by Dell, and they were known for like having the best sales training program in the country. We went through it was a bunch of kids right out of school. It's a 6-week program. We did so much role play. And it took me a really long time to get to the point where I understood why I was asking all of these questions. But they did
Yeah.
a really good job of being like, when you did the role play, they'd say, okay, you asked this question. What were you trying to get to? What was your goal of the conversation? And like, they just did a really good job of like the role play, but like at every point asking you, like, why are you doing this? And your answer should never be to figure out, like, is this really my champion? Right? Like, there's other ways
Yeah.
to, is this really my champion without saying, are you my champion? Are you going to
Right.
advocate for me internally?
Yeah. Um, I mean, yeah, that's like hard to teach, and it's hard to. I don't envy enablement who's out there trying to like build the internal methodology who has to do it. I also don't envy, the RevOps side that's like, I need all these signals, or we need this so that we can have like a really good data visibility and, model going forward. I know one of the quotes I harvested that you had said in effect was like, you've got go to market, and that team's focused on like today's today's problems, like today's goals, and the RevOps team has to be thinking tomorrow or quarters down the road. Like, unpack that for me because I think that's really interesting of like how are you thinking in the future, the problems you have to solve in the future that no one maybe has asked you for yet.
Yeah, I mean, I always say, like, first we wanna unblock the teams to be able to execute, and I want sales laser focused on hitting their number that quarter, right? I don't want RevOps to be the blocker there because we do need to be thinking 2 quarters ahead, 3 quarters ahead. And usually it comes from what is the rate of growth of the company? You know, where do you wanna be in a year, 3 years, depending on which stage of startup you're at, right? So at Checker, we did 3-year planning. At BuildOps, it's kind of more like 1.5 to 2, right? We know generally what target growth we want to see. And then you start kind of thinking back, okay, so like in order to hit that type of growth, like, are we talking about different channels, different markets? Are we talking about like doubling or tripling our sales team? Are we like, how do we think we're going to target that? And what are the challenges that we see that come with that? Or where do we want to start working towards today? So like a very, very basic example would be if you are pushing into the enterprise and you know you need to scale your enterprise team next year and you know it takes them 9 months to ramp, you probably need to start hiring them now. Another one could be, okay, if we want to start going international, we need to start preparing for that now. If we know we want to raise our prices next year as a lever? What are the things we need to do now to get our infrastructure ready for that? There's a number if we want to push into a new market. Let's make sure our database is ready, like our enablement programs are ready. Like, how do we want to approach that? And so it's more around thinking like, okay, at least at this stage of startups that I've been at, right, where you are kind of in that scale up and growth phase, it is more focused around growth. Sometimes it could also be more focused around efficiency. And if your goals long term are more around how do we push towards profitability or get more efficient or reduce headcount and increase ARR, things like that. It's just what is your overall goal as the company? And then how are you going to get there? And how do you start working towards that?
What do you think is going to be really different for the folks in the RevOps role? Pick your time frame, a quarter, 4 quarters from now.
I think the two main things that stick out, and I do think, I mean, things are changing so fast now that who knows how quickly it'll be. Will it be 6 months from now? Will it be 2 years from now? Right? With the push of AI, foundation becomes even more critical, becomes like a non-negotiable. Right. So, like, a great example of that is data. And if you have AI internally, like I have people asking Claude, what was our enterprise ARR growth the last 2 years? And show me quarter over quarter. If your data definitions are not built out, if you don't have really strong reporting built out, then they're just going to get wrong answers. Right.
Right.
And so it doesn't necessarily replace from that perspective. You still need to focus on the foundation and the infrastructure. However, I think we can get to then like the innovative stuff quicker. So if you're familiar with like the pyramid where it's like foundation and then, you know, standard operating procedure and then innovation, I think in RevOps, we always want to get to those like fun, innovative things, but often are pulled down into that infrastructure and more kind of standard run the business. I think we'll see that middle layer disappear over time or shrink over time, I should say, doing less things like, oh, I need to reshuffle the book. Oh, like I need to change ownership or merge these duplicates or, you know, like the manual stuff that doesn't really add much. And we will get to focus more on the innovative layer. I think you will see tool consolidation. How do we get reps logging into one place to do everything from, we like got back to tool sprawl at some point where it's like, there's one place they know their performance, they know their target accounts, they can, you know, email them from it, they can make calls from it, like one central place. I think you will start to see less data entry, right? Like suddenly call recording has become one of the most valuable tools we have out there because going back to your point around it's not just a checklist, like why ask someone to fill it out? As long as they're asking the right questions and got the right data on that call, we have all of that. We shouldn't have to ask you, hey, what's your pipeline? What's your forecast? Right? We should just know. And we're starting to see that. And I think really it all comes down to like, how good is your data? How much do you trust it? Right. And so that's why that core foundation is just going to become even more critical. But then hopefully we can get to the fun stuff quicker.
Absolutely. I love that. That was great. Well, this has been awesome to hang out. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Where can folks find you?
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. I mean, LinkedIn's perfect. That's where they find me. Lauren, this has been so great. I appreciate your time today, and thanks for joining the Sales Operator series.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Brian. It was fun. Appreciate it.